Legius Judaeorum, or the law of the Jews. Perhaps that was referring to the tablets of the law, or maybe a Torah scroll. You can see they're clearly carrying menorah. The sign next to it says Candelabrum Judaeorum, the Jewish candelabra. And on the right, they have the Sacra Judaeorum, the holy thing of the Jews, which appears to be the shulchan with the altar with the bad in the area, perhaps. The Romans also imposed some terrible taxes and some restrictions on Jewish activity, which I'd like to explore in a later lecture. But there is a saving moment in the reaction of the Pharisees, in particular a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who saw early on that the revolt against Rome was doomed to failure. And in a rather dramatic moment, he had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem to actually meet with Vespasian directly. This is one of the details of the Talmud office. And he makes a request of Vespasian, actually 3 requests. But the one that's especially significant for us is he says to Vespasian, in Hebrew we have the phrase, Ten li Yavne v'chachameha, give me the city of Yavne, Yamnia in Greek, and its sages, which meant that he wanted to have a safe base where the pacifistic Pharisees could retreat and could continue to engage in religious studies. This ultimately was the seed from which future Jewish leadership would grow, and the future of the Jewish people would be preserved through these scholars studying the traditional values and texts of Judaism. We will continue this in future lectures. Thank you very much for watching.
Now, are these young players that are coming up, are these guys embracing like a healthier lifestyle? Because one of the things about pool is like it's always been connected, at least when I was young, it was always connected to, especially the gambling, connected to a lot of partying, a lot of amphetamines, cocaine, and then, just changing. It used to be just a game played at the bar. Now it's a sport. I think now in the U.S.,
if we move forward about 45 years from the destruction of the temple and the fall of Masada, we get to another period of violence called the Kitos Rebellion. Now, it's a very mysterious kind of rebellion. We have scattered data points from different sources that all reveal something about this rebellion, but we're not really sure about much of the most essential questions. But we should say one thing to begin with. Many scholars argue whether or not this is really the second Roman-Jewish war or something different. It's basically a primarily diaspora phenomenon. It's something that you see primarily outside of Israel, in other words, and not so much in Judea itself. But let's try and understand at least some things about this Kitos Rebellion. The Kitos Rebellion occurs at the very end of the rule of the Emperor Trajan. The 5 decades since the destruction of the temple have been absolutely terrible for the Jews. There is a tremendous amount of post-destruction trauma that is definitely spiritual in nature. I mean, the Jews had invested all of their spiritual understanding of how they related to the infinite through the temple. And even when the temple was corrupted by a priesthood that was essentially something that could be bought from the Romans, there was still this idea that somehow the temple was the hinge upon which the entire universe turned. And now with that temple gone, what exactly would Judaism do? What would Judaism look like? It was a period of phenomenal demographic upheaval. You have literally tens of thousands of Jews taken off in slavery to Rome. You have refugees who are scattered throughout the entire region on the Eastern Mediterranean, the Iberian and Greek peninsulas, around the Black Sea littoral, and further east through Mesopotamia. And you don't have the same kind of center in Israel as you had before. Would the Jewish people even survive this tremendous trauma? The Romans, for their part, did many things to make things worse for the Jews. They certainly want to stamp out any possibility of a future revolt, and so there were all kinds of measures put in place to try and demean the Jews both spiritually, psychologically, demographically, and financially. The Fiscus Judaicus was instituted, and this was a replacement of the mandatory Machatzis HaShekel, the half shekel tax that Jews had from biblical times paid all over the world toward the upkeep of the Temple of Jerusalem. The Fiscus Judaicus tax took that money and made it mandatory, but instead of devoting it to the upkeep of the Temple of Jerusalem, it was directed to Rome and to the upkeep of the Temple for Jupiter. I mean, really offensive kind of things for the Jews. And at the same time, the messianic ferment that we saw with the birth of Christianity was still continuing. In fact, it would take another couple of decades before it would have its final defeat, at least in the 2nd century, under Bar Kokhba. Now, Trajan himself, towards the end of his rule, became involved in a very heavy war with the Parthian Empire, which was the Persian Empire that controlled Babylonia. The Parthian Empire would ultimately fall, and in their successor empire, the Sasanians, that's when the main elements of the Talmud would be put together. But at any rate, Trajan waged war against the Parthians, and he actually penetrated all the way to the very bottom of Mesopotamia. That is, this region here that you can see is sort of like a yellowish color going right down to the Persian Gulf. This was briefly controlled by Roman troops. Now, what's interesting for our purposes, and connecting it to the Kitos Rebellion, is that the Jews in Mesopotamia apparently sided with the Parthians against the Roman invaders. Which is perhaps not surprising. Jews had been living in Babylonia since the 6th century before the Common Era. Meaning they've been there for 800 years. They certainly have roots sunk deep into that territory. And when the Romans came in invading, they took up arms to defend their homeland alongside the Parthians. This obviously was not taken very lightly by the Romans, and Lucius Quietus, who was a commander in charge of the region, was put in charge of also devastating the Jewish population and quashing any resistance to Roman rule. So this is one element of the Kitos Rebellion. It is Lucius Quietus' early participation. There will be another chapter with his story as well, and maybe I should give it away. The word Kitos in the Kitos Rebellion is probably from his surname, Lucius Quietus. That's probably how we get Kitos. So it's named essentially after him. Perhaps because of his notorious activities putting down the Jewish rebels in Mesopotamia, or I shouldn't say the rebels, the Jewish defenders of Mesopotamia, but it could also have to do with his later activities in Judea. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a diaspora affair. It was certainly not limited to Mesopotamia with the advance into Parthian Empire territory in the year 114. We begin to see it also develop on the coast of North Africa in particular. Let's have a look at this map here, where you can see the extent of the Roman Empire at the time of Trajan's death in 117, 117. First of all, we have the activity in Mesopotamia, which is related to the invasion of the Parthian Empire. But then we have some interesting things happening in what would be today Libya. The Kitos Rebellion had major activity in this town. The pronunciation, I know some people are really sticklers for pronunciation. I've looked it up and I've heard it pronounced as Cyrene in English. In Greek, it would have been something like Kurene. So I'm probably going to say Kurene, and I'll probably be wrong, but this will be the first time. But anyway, this is one of the locations of major rebel activity during this period. And then we also have significant activity throughout Egypt, and then finally in Cyprus. And once all of this diaspora activity is discussed, we're going to look very briefly at Judea, where, of course, there was the Ptolemist Kitos, the Kitos Rebellion itself, as described in the Talmud. Let's look at Kurene first. The various sources that refer to this assert that there may have been some kind of messianic issue to this, because there is an individual who is referred to as Lukuas in one source and Andreas in a different source. It is possible that this is the same person. It was not at all uncommon in the ancient period, especially in Greek and Roman areas, for Jews to have two names, a Hebrew name and a Greek name, or a local name. I myself have two names, right? I have a Hebrew name that my friends know me by, and I have Henry, which I publish under, and stuff like that. So anyways, but he referred to himself in one of these sources as a king. So that implies some kind of unusual political, although some of the church historians suggest it was sort of a false messianic thing. And under this Lukua/Andreas, there was a report of Jewish attacks on Roman temples and public buildings in particular. It's an interesting aspect of this revolt is that it seems to be one that is definitely attacking Rome. And again, remember, it's just a few decades since the destruction of the temple. And there are a lot of Jews who are very angry. And let us not forget that there are a lot of Jews who were originally rebels in the First War who have fled to various cities in the diaspora, and they could be influencing this uprising again in about the year 115. Now, one of our most important historians that tells us a little bit about the People's Rebellion is Cassius Dio. He is a Roman historian who was active at the end of the second and the first half of the 3rd century. And he's great for a lot of things, but there's certain areas where you just don't know how seriously to take him. So, for example, when he describes this rebellion in Kyrene, he puts it like this, and just listen to this language. Meanwhile, the Jews in the region of Kyrene had put a certain Andreas at their head and were destroying both the Romans and the Greeks. They would eat the flesh of their victims, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. But that's not all. Many they sawed in two from the head downwards. Others they gave to wild beasts, still others they forced to fight as gladiators. I mean, it's hard to take this seriously. It's just so bizarre and so un-Jewish. Certainly Jews have gone to war, and it's not impossible to imagine atrocities happening when Jews, like any people, go to war, but these are over the top. And in fact, when you look at Cassius Dios's other treatments of barbarian attacks on Rome, they also appear quite, outre. I wanted to read for you the passage where he describes how the Britons deal with the attack from the Romans, and oh my gosh, I can't even look at that because it's actually pornographic in its nature. So just trust me, Cassius Dios is liable to exaggerate for dramatic effect. Egypt also saw widespread rebellions between years 115 and 117, widespread Jewish rebellions, who were apparently, the Jews were taking advantage of the absence of Roman forces who had gone off to fight against the Parthian Empire in Mesopotamia. And once again, it's similar kinds of targets. Temples, shrines, for example, the Shrine of Nemesis at Memphis, public works, roadways, things like that. It seems like the Jews rebelling are really directing their attacks specifically at the Roman Empire. It seems to have a very political motive. The economic motive does not seem to rise to the surface, and other than those messianic references, it seems to be something that is really an attempted uprising. It is fascinating to think, though, like, why are the Jews all over the diaspora? Do they really think they're going to throw Rome off? But they obviously are somewhat coordinated in doing this. There was, of course, a harsh military response from Trajan, who came back with heavy forces and many killed. This is the period when the great synagogue of Alexandria, which the Talmud says was so large that in order to know when to answer Amen to the person leading the prayers, they had to wave big flags. You could see the flags and know that it was up to that part. But this is the period when the great synagogue of Egypt, of Alexandria, Egypt, was destroyed. Jewish property was seized, and basically at this point, by the time we get to the end of the Parthian War, the Jewish community in North Africa goes into a steep decline.